It's 1979. School ends at 3. You walk home. You let yourself in with the key around your neck. The house is quiet. Your parents won't be back until 6. That's 3 hours. 3 hours with no phone, no computer, no one texting you, no one to check in with, no notifications telling you something happened somewhere. Just you. And the house. And whatever you decide to do with the afternoon. For Gen X kids, this happened hundreds of times. Thousands of times, for some of them. It was so routine, it stopped being notable. You ate whatever was in the cupboard, you maybe watched TV, you maybe went outside, you figured it out. Nobody asked how you were doing, nobody was managing the experience, nobody was home. That turns out to matter more than anyone realized at the time. My name is Eddie Freeman. Every week this channel looks at how generations developed differently, and what those differences actually cost, or give us. Why are they like that? Subscribe and you'll get a new one every week. What happened to Gen X children in those empty houses wasn't just neglect with a positive spin. Something genuinely developmental was occurring, and it took decades of psychology research to name what it was. Boredom activates a specific part of the brain called the default mode network, the same system responsible for daydreaming, imagination, self-reflection, and creative thinking. When a child is bored, with no external stimulus available to rescue them from the discomfort, the brain starts generating its own activity. It wanders. It imagines. It makes connections between unrelated things. It starts, essentially, doing the work of becoming a self. Research on child development is consistent on this point. Unstructured time with no scheduled activity, no screen, no adult direction, builds executive function, emotional regulation, creative problem solving, and crucially, the ability to tolerate discomfort without immediately seeking an exit from it. Not because doing nothing is magical, but because the process of figuring out what to do with nothing is where those skills get built. Gen X got thousands of hours of that process during the exact developmental window when the brain is most primed to be shaped by it. Nobody designed it as an intervention. It was just what the 1970s and 80s looked like for millions of children whose parents were working and whose society hadn't yet invented the infrastructure to keep kids continuously entertained and supervised. The result was a generation that learned, in the most unglamorous way possible, how to be alone without it being a crisis. The psychologist D.W. Winnicott wrote about this decades before anyone was applying it to generational analysis. He argued that the capacity to be alone, really alone, with yourself, not performing for anyone or filling silence with noise, is one of the most important psychological capacities a person can develop. And paradoxically, it develops best in early life, in the presence of a reliable adult who isn't hovering. The child learns that they can be left alone and survive it, that their own company is enough, that silence is not a problem to be solved. Gen X learned this by accident. Empty house, key around the neck, 3 hours until someone came home. Whatever the intention behind it, the outcome was a generation that built a relationship with solitude that the generations before and after simply didn't have the same reason to build. Boomers had different childhoods, more supervised, more communal, more shaped by a culture of togetherness that post-war prosperity and stay-at-home parenting enabled. They developed differently. Millennials were the first helicopter-parented generation. Their childhoods were scheduled, organized sports, enrichment activities, playdates booked in advance. When they were bored, something was provided. When they were alone, the phone arrived. Gen Z never experienced unstructured time at scale. By the time they were old enough to be left alone, they were never actually alone. The phone was there. The algorithm was there. There was always something available to fill the gap before the gap could become anything. 73% of Gen Z report feeling alone sometimes or always, the highest of any generation. That number is striking because it seems to contradict everything. Gen Z is the most digitally connected generation in history. They are never more than a few seconds from contact with other people. They have more tools for communication than any previous generation could have imagined. And they are the loneliest. The explanation for this is something that Gen X understands in their bones, even if they've never articulated it. There's a difference between being alone and feeling lonely. And there's a difference between solitude and loneliness that the constant connection model of modern life has thoroughly confused. Solitude is chosen. It's comfortable. It's the experience of being with yourself without distress. Loneliness is the feeling that your own company isn't enough, that you need external input to feel okay, and the external input isn't landing in the right way, or isn't available, or is there but still leaves you feeling hollow. Gen Z grew up never learning to be alone because they were never asked to be. The phone was always there before the discomfort of solitude could become the resource of solitude. They went from stimulation directly to loneliness, without the middle step, the capacity to be with themselves ever getting built. When the stimulation stops, there's nothing to fill it with. That's the loneliness epidemic in a sentence. Gen X doesn't talk about this much, partly because talking about yourself is not really a Gen X move, and partly because the capacity they built is so native to them that they can't quite see it. It's like asking a fish to explain water. But it shows up in their behavior in ways that other generations notice and find slightly baffling. Gen X can sit in a waiting room without looking at their phone. Not always, not every one of them, but at a rate that is genuinely different from younger generations. They can drive without a podcast filling every minute. They can eat lunch alone without performing it for anyone. They can have a weekend with nothing scheduled and not feel a creeping dread about what it means. None of this is virtue. It's not discipline. It's not moral superiority over generations who are more phone dependent. It's just a muscle that got built through repetition during a formative period in an environment that had no choice but to build it. The cruel irony of all this is that Gen X, having been raised to be so comfortable alone, went on, in many cases, to become the helicopter parents who ensured their own children never had to develop that capacity. The same generation that came home to empty houses and figured out 3 hours of unstructured time by themselves watched their own Gen Z kids grow up scheduled and supervised and continuously entertained. The people who most understood the value of solitude were the ones who worked hardest to make sure their children never had to sit with it. You can trace this directly to the fact that Gen X knew what genuine neglect looked like. They remembered being genuinely unsupervised, genuinely in situations that weren't always fine, genuinely alone in ways that were sometimes hard. And when they became parents, they overcorrected toward the thing they'd been denied: attention, presence, supervision. They meant well, they loved their kids, and in doing so, they may have accidentally withheld the thing that the empty house had given them. None of this argues that Gen X had a better childhood. Some latchkey kids were genuinely neglected. Some were scared. Some were in unsafe situations. The research is clear that context mattered enormously, and that younger children and those in unstable homes were more vulnerable to negative outcomes. But for the broad middle, the millions of kids who had basically functional homes and parents who were simply at work, the empty house produced something real. A tolerance for solitude, a comfort with their own company, a relationship with silence that doesn't require it to be filled. That capacity is increasingly rare. It is not something you can download. It is not something that develops in a person who has never been made to sit with the discomfort of nothing happening and figure out what comes next from inside themselves. Gen X got it by accident. The generations that followed didn't get it at all. And the loneliness statistics suggest that its absence has a cost that nobody fully priced in when they handed every 10-year-old a smartphone and called it connection. Let me know in the comments, if you're Gen X, do you actually feel comfortable alone in a way that feels different from younger people you know? And if you're a millennial or Gen Z, is the idea of being genuinely alone, no phone, no podcast, no music, something that sounds peaceful, or something that sounds genuinely uncomfortable? I want to know where people actually land on this.